On the 28th of May, 1945, just 3 weeks after Nazi Germany surrendered, a British ship called the Almanzora quietly docked at a Soviet port. On board were over 1,000 men in tattered uniforms. They were Soviet citizens, former Red Army soldiers, and they had survived the war. They should have been heroes. Instead, the moment they stepped off that gangplank, they were arrested. But this story isn't about the men who came back. This is about the ones who didn't. The ones who stayed in Britain. Changed their names, married local women, opened small shops, raised British children, and spent the rest of their lives looking over their shoulder because the government that was supposed to protect them had already signed a secret agreement to send them back. This is the story of the Soviet POWs who chose survival over loyalty and what it cost them. To understand how Soviet soldiers ended up in British camps, we need to go back to the beginning of the war and one of its darkest chapters. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army was catastrophically unprepared. Within months, millions of Soviet soldiers had been surrounded, cut off, and captured. By the end of 1941 alone, Germany held over 3 million Soviet POWs. By the end of the war, that number would reach nearly 5.5 million. For many of those men, capture was not a choice. They ran out of ammunition. Their officers were dead. They were encircled with no way out. But back in Moscow, Stalin saw it differently. In August 1941, Stalin issued Order Number 270, a directive that declared Soviet soldiers who surrendered to be traitors. Not victims, not prisoners, traitors. Their families at home could face punishment simply for being related to a man who had been captured. And so for the hundreds of thousands of Soviet men who ended up in Western Allied hands, either because they escaped German camps or because the Allies liberated the camps they were in, going home was not the relief it should have been. It was a sentence. Some of these men had been forced by the Germans to serve in auxiliary labor battalions. The Germans called them Hilfswillig, which translates directly from German as those willing to help, but the word willing was bitterly ironic. Most of these men had been given a simple choice in the prisoner camps: work for us or starve. Faced with that choice, survival usually won. They were nicknamed Hiwis, a shortened form of Hilfswillig, and they dug fortifications, drove supply trucks, cooked food, and buried the German dead. They were not combat soldiers, but they wore German uniforms, and that, in the eyes of Soviet law, was collaboration. Others had been placed in Ost battalions, Eastern battalions, and sent to the Atlantic Wall to guard coastlines in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. When Allied troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, they captured German positions and found men inside those positions who were not German at all. They were Russian, Ukrainian, Kazakh, Uzbek, Georgian. These men surrendered again, this time to the British and Americans, and now they sat in camps across England, Scotland, and Wales, waiting to find out what would happen to them. In February 1945, 3 men sat down together in the Yalta Palace on the Crimean coast and divided up the post-war world: Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain; Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States; and Joseph Stalin, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Churchill was 69 years old, exhausted, and already privately worried about Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe. Roosevelt was dying. He would be dead within 2 months. And Stalin arrived at Yalta, knowing that he held the stronger hand. Soviet forces were already deep inside Germany. The war in Europe was nearly won, and the USSR had won it at a cost of 27 million lives. Among the many agreements signed at Yalta was one that received almost no public attention at the time, but would determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of people. It was called the Repatriation Agreement. In simple terms, it said this: all Soviet citizens in Allied custody would be returned to the Soviet Union, no exceptions, no individual review, no choice. Churchill's Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, had pushed for this agreement. Eden was a sophisticated diplomat who spoke fluent Russian and understood the Soviet system well. He knew, or strongly suspected, what awaited many of these men upon return. But he also understood the political calculus. Britain needed Soviet cooperation in post-war Europe, and Stalin had made it clear that the repatriation of his citizens was non-negotiable. Years later, Eden would describe the Yalta Repatriation Clause as one of the most uncomfortable decisions of his career. "We knew it was not a happy matter," he wrote in his memoirs, "but we believed we had no alternative. The British government knew, or should have known, what awaited many of these men upon return. Soviet defectors, intelligence reports, and even Red Cross observers had made it clear that returnees were being screened by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Those who were deemed to have collaborated with the enemy, even involuntarily, even under threat of death, were sent to the Gulag. Many were shot, but the political logic of the time was cold and simple. Britain needed Stalin's cooperation in post-war Europe. The fate of a few thousand displaced soldiers was not going to stand in the way of that, and so the repatriations began. What happened at some of those handover points was deeply disturbing. At Lienz, in Austria, Cossack soldiers and their families, many of whom had fought with the Germans, were handed over to Soviet forces in late May 1945. When the British announced that they were to be transferred, some threw themselves into the Drava River rather than go back. Mothers held their children and jumped. British soldiers, following orders, used rifle butts to force men onto the trucks. At least 30 people died at Lienz. The true number may be higher. In Britain itself, the process was quieter, but no less final, and yet not everyone went back. Amid the chaos of post-war displacement, a number of Soviet POWs in Britain found ways to slip through the cracks. Some were helped by sympathetic British officers who looked the other way. Some simply disappeared, walking away from camps in the confusion of the final months of the war before the repatriation machinery was fully in motion. Others were saved by a legal technicality. Men who could prove or convincingly claim that they were not Soviet citizens, as defined by the 1939 borders, were sometimes exempted. Poles who had lived in Soviet-occupied territory, Baltic nationals from Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, whose countries had been annexed by the USSR, but whose annexation Britain had never formally recognized. These men got to stay, but what happened to them next? Post-war Britain was exhausted, damaged, and desperately short of labor. The government actively recruited foreign workers, Poles, Ukrainians, Balts, Italians, to help rebuild the country. Many former POWs and displaced persons found work in mines, in agriculture, in the new National Health Service. Soviet men who had managed to stay found themselves folded into this wave of anonymous reconstruction. They took new names. Ivan became John. Alexei became Alex. Mykola became Nicholas. Some married British women, relationships that had sometimes begun in the POW camps themselves, when local women had worked as translators, nurses, or farmhands and encountered the prisoners. These marriages provided legal grounding. A British wife meant British residency. A British wife meant safety. One documented case is that of Fyodor Polyakov, a Red Army sergeant from Kharkov who was captured in 1942 during the Second Battle of Kharkov, one of the most devastating Soviet defeats of the entire war. Polyakov spent 2 years in a German prisoner camp before being conscripted into a Hiwi labor unit and eventually ending up in France. He was captured by British forces near Caen in August 1944. In the British camp, Polyakov told interrogators he was Polish. His mother had been from the Lao region, which before the war had been part of Poland, and he spoke some Polish. It was enough. He was reclassified as a displaced Polish national and transferred to a civilian resettlement program. By 1947, Fyodor Polyakov was living in Coventry under the name Frederick Palmer. He worked as a mechanic. He married a local woman named Dorothy in 1949. They had 2 daughters. He never told Dorothy his real name until 1971, 22 years into their marriage, when he became ill and feared he might die without anyone knowing who he really was. Dorothy, by all accounts, took it calmly. He was still Fred, she later told her daughter. The name didn't change who he was. Fyodor Polyakov, Frederick Palmer, died in Coventry in 1983. His daughters only discovered the full extent of his story when researchers from a British university contacted them in the 2000s. Surviving in Britain was one thing. Living there, truly living, without fear, was something else entirely. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, Soviet intelligence, first the NKVD, then the MGB, then the KGB, maintained an active interest in Soviet citizens who had gone missing from the repatriation lists. Britain was a primary target of Soviet espionage during the Cold War, and among the things Soviet handlers looked for were their own people who had defected or disappeared. For men living under assumed identities, this created a constant background anxiety. A stranger at the door who asked too many questions. A letter with a Soviet postmark. A newspaper article about a defector being exposed. Every one of these things could send a man's heart into his throat. Some men moved frequently, never settling long enough to attract attention. Some refused to join Ukrainian or Russian émigré communities, even when they desperately wanted human connection with people who shared their language and their past, because those communities were known to be monitored by Soviet intelligence. Soviet intelligence operations in Britain during the Cold War were extensive and well documented. The Cambridge Five, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross are the most famous example. These were British intelligence officers who had been recruited as Soviet agents while students at Cambridge in the 1930s and had passed secrets to Moscow for decades. But the KGB also ran lower-level networks specifically tasked with tracking down Soviet citizens who had evaded repatriation. There are documented cases from the 1950s of Soviet agents approaching displaced Soviet men in Britain, sometimes presenting themselves as fellow countrymen, sometimes as representatives of the Soviet embassy offering amnesty and attempting to pressure them into returning or into working as informants. Some men disappeared after these contacts. Whether they returned voluntarily, were coerced, or met some other fate is in most cases unknown. Others refused and lived. To understand what the men who stayed in Britain were avoiding, it helps to look at what happened to the ones who went back. The scale of Soviet repatriation after World War II was enormous. By 1946, the Soviet Union had processed over 5 million returnees, soldiers, forced laborers, prisoners of war, civilians. They were all run through filtration camps, where NKVD officers interrogated them about their time in enemy hands. The questions were designed to find guilt. How did you survive? Why were you not killed? Who did you speak to? What did you tell them? Those who were deemed to have collaborated, which could mean anything from having voluntarily worked for the Germans to simply having survived long enough to be liberated, faced a range of punishments. Some received reduced prison sentences and were sent to work camps in Siberia or the Far East. Some were stripped of their civil rights. Some were shot. Even those who passed the filtration process were rarely welcomed home. They returned to find their families had suffered under the stigma of having a captured relative. Their jobs were gone. Their apartments had been reassigned. One Soviet officer who had been captured at Stalingrad and survived 3 years in German captivity described returning to his hometown as walking into a room where everyone already knows you are guilty of something, they're just deciding what to charge you with. He was arrested 18 months after his return. He spent 8 years in a Siberian labor camp. He was one of millions. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s that the full story of the forced repatriations began to emerge in the West. Historian Nicholas Bethel's book, The Last Secret, published in 1974, was among the first to document the scale of what had happened, including the scenes of violence at the handover points and the fates that awaited those who were returned. The British government's role was deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. These had been decisions made by democratic governments, by Churchill, by Anthony Eden, by Foreign Office officials, by military commanders, in full knowledge that many of the men being returned would be imprisoned or killed. Veterans who had participated in the handovers spoke of the experience with evident distress decades later. "We knew what we were doing," one British officer told Bethel. "We just told ourselves we had no choice." For the men who had stayed, the ones who had hidden on farms, changed their names, built quiet lives in Yorkshire and Lancashire and Wales, the emergence of this history was complicated. Some came forward, some gave interviews carefully, some took their stories to the grave. A small number in the era of glasnost and the collapse of the Soviet Union made contact with relatives in Ukraine or Russia for the first time in 40 or 50 years. Some traveled back, old men now walking through villages they had left as young soldiers. Some found family, some found only graves. On the 28th of May, 1945, the ship Almanzora docked at a Soviet port and the men on board were arrested the moment they stepped ashore. But some men were not on that ship. Some were hiding in farmhouses in Yorkshire. Some were working night shifts in Lancashire mills. Some were already falling in love with women they would spend the rest of their lives with, in a country that was not their own, in a language they were still learning. They survived the war, they survived Stalin, they survived the Cold War, they survived by becoming invisible, and most of them right up until the end remained invisible still. Frederick Palmer, Vasil Harasimenko, Nikolai, whatever his real name was, men who history nearly erased twice, first by the war, then by the silence they had to keep to stay alive. Their stories deserve to be remembered. If this story stayed with you, and I hope it did, the best thing you can do right now is hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this are worth showing to more people. Because these aren't just old war stories, they're about choices governments make behind closed doors and about ordinary people who paid the price. And if you want more, subscribe. We cover the hidden side of history, the decisions that weren't in the textbooks, the people history tried to forget, and the moments that still echo today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.